Just wait for the clock to tick over to 5 and then I quickly start. Okay, good evening and once again, welcome to the Vivekananda Lecture Series 2022, a series of 12 lectures starting with the inaugural lecture today, followed by a lecture on the 12th of every month, January through December 2022. The inaugural lecture will be on the theme that is today, Vivekananda, a retrospective analysis of his message and its relevance today. It is an absolute pleasure and privilege to have as our guest speaker today, Sri Guru Rohit Arya. And it's something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. Thank you for accepting and coming over. And this series is brought to you by the Vivekananda Institute of Indian Studies, which is a unit of the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement. Sri Guru Rohit Arya is a yogi, author, and polymath, being a spiritual mentor, a writer, a mythologist, and a vibrant speaker. He has written the first book on Vastu to be published in the West, which has been translated into 5 European languages in Hebrew. The first book on Tarot to be published in India, and co-authored a book on Mini Yajna called Sacred Flames, and is the creator of the Sacred India Tarot, which is an 82-card deck and book based on Hindu epics and Puranas. He was the editor of the Leadership Review and on the advisory panel of IndiaYogi.com, the first spiritual portal in the country. He was the director of ProFactor, a leadership and change facilitation corporate training outfit. He has been an arts critic and socio-cultural commentator for over 2 decades. Sri Guru is also a lineage master in the 8th spiritual breath system of yoga. He founded the Arya Yoga Sangha in 2012 and leads multiple meditation circles each week. The videos of his spiritual talks on various subjects can be found on his YouTube channel, The Arya Yogi. More than anything else, personally over the last 3 years, I have immensely benefited from even having interacted with someone with Sri Guru. I think, and I must say that there's been much learning. I've rarely seen anybody with the scope of knowledge across multiple subjects. And so the format of the lecture will be as follows. Sri Guru Rohit Arya will speak for about 20 minutes, and that will be followed on the topic, and that will be followed by a moderated Q&A. At the end of the session, we will have a short vote of thanks that will be proposed by Sri Sudarshan of VIS. And participants can, post their questions as well on the chat box. Over to you, Sri Guru.
Namaste, everyone. Thank you, Ramesh, for inviting me on.
Pleasure.
Swami Vivekananda has always been like my great idol from childhood. Probably from having grown up in Calcutta, where every home had his picture of Sri Ramakrishna. So to speak about Swami Vivekananda today on his Tithi is a very big thing. So I thank you for the opportunity. I normally avoid all these. For a few years, I have not been making any videos. I have not been talking in public, but this one, I was not going to pass up. And I said, okay, this one I need to speak. So our topic is very interesting, the continued relevance of Swami Vivekananda. Now it's 160 years. He died in 1905. So you might wonder, what's the big deal? But Nicholas Nassim Taleb has an important sort of touchstone where he says that anything of value that endures becomes more valuable. So if after 160 years we are still talking about him, there must be some value there. There must be some reason why. Like what is his relevance? Now today, of course, he has become somewhat a figure of controversy and things like that. But leave all that. For the time being, leave all that. Let us just talk about, I don't know how many people are aware, but Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, who was regarded as the most brilliant politician of his time, he once made the very interesting statement that but for Vivekananda, we would have lost our religion and never gained our freedom. said it was Vivekananda who was the direct inspiration for the freedom struggle, the second part. And the fact is, we are again in that same situation where once again, the religion is at least under attack. We have got our freedom, but the religion is now once again under phenomenal attack. You know, it is a concept called characterological evil, where something is bad because it exists. This is a formulation by an American professor called Shelby Steele. And unfortunately, for large parts of the world, for large parts of people within our own country, the Hindu Dharma seems to be a characterological evil. Something that is bad merely because it exists and therefore it must be wiped out. And this was exactly the situation in Vivekananda's time. And we are full circle, we have come back to it once more. So given his response, given how he pushed back against that attitude of that Hindu Dharma is a characterological evil, perhaps we can find many, many valuable things in how he approached it. And while, yes, it has been a long time, 1905, and now we are in 2022, are we really that different? We still haven't achieved full electrification. Electrification was a common in European countries by the 1890s, you know, and in India, we are still in the race to achieve electrification. He was in the age of steam, but he was also in a time of great change. You see, he was a Victorian. He was a Victorian, and the Victorians were people who were bringing in the modern world. You know, there was a time of great change, and today we are in the second great technological revolution, the second great change, you know, where everything has gone online. And so he can serve as a map, or he can serve as a guidance, or he can serve as pointers for how to navigate this change. Because let me tell you one thing. This now might be a slightly harsh thing to say, or maybe a controversial thing to say, but you know, Ramesh knew what he was getting when he called me on. So you know, I'll say, see, when you transition from a traditional society to a modern society, it causes a lot of psychological problems. It causes a lot of issues. The phenomenon was described as future shock by the sociologist Alvin Toffler in a very good book of what happens. And you see, it is very interesting that Vivekananda advised Indians to follow Japan, because when he had visited Japan in the late 1890s, he saw that they had completely transformed themselves in 25 years. What he didn't see was that it came at a very horrific trauma. It came at the price of very horrific trauma, because they went from being completely traditional into completely modernized in 25 years. And the controversial part of that, which I'm going to say, is that the only people who can really thrive when tradition is abandoned and modernity embraced like that are sociopaths and psychopaths. Decent people have a lot of difficulty accommodating the change in the transition. And we are now again in a situation where our tradition is under attack from all sides. And the narrative in the media, in everywhere, the narrative from the educational institutions, from the entertainment media, everywhere the narrative is that tradition itself is the problem. Tradition itself should be junked, you know, and the people who are comfortable, you see, it has been one of the great paradoxes that the two most civilized countries in the world, the most civilized country in the Western world, which was Germany, and the most civilized country in the Eastern world, which was Japan, civilized and cultured. They were leaders in civilization and culture. They became the greatest monsters and asuras and rakshasas in leading up to the Second World War. We all know what Germany did, but most people don't know what Japan did. So, you know, I am, in one sense, I won't say I am comfortable, but I am not entirely upset that change happens slowly in India, because if change happens too fast, there will be a lot of consequence at a psychological level, which will not be pleasant from at a social point. So in that sense, Vivekananda's thing of take up what is true, hold fast to your guns, because he was very strong for tradition, even though in many ways he was not traditional. One of the ways in which he was not traditional was when he was on a strange journey, he would go in half pants. And that used to really upset people, that a Swami is traveling wearing half pants. And he's like, it is comfortable, why shouldn't I? But on the other hand, he was a very, very strong man for maintaining traditional forms, because he said, if you have to choose between the traditional and the reformer, choose the traditionalist, because the traditionalist is rooted in his native ground. You can make something of it. But the reformer is a pale imitation of something that he hardly understands. And nothing much is going to happen, which, So in that sense, I would say what we can learn from him, or what is relevant from him, one is that immense self-confidence that he used to have. And that self-confidence was a confidence of being part of an ancient culture and an ancient civilization. It was not just that I am Vivekananda, I am superior to all men. But it was very much that I am a representative of an ancient culture, an ancient religion, an ancient civilization. And he had that tremendous, I don't know how, it was overwhelming, his sense of worth and self-value, which is very different from arrogance and ego. It was just a sense of that we are the inheritors of something grand and magnificent, and we should celebrate that. We should be proud of that, which unfortunately I don't see much today. Today the whole narrative has become like we should be ashamed and constantly apologizing, which I reject completely. But I will say very clearly that I learned this attitude from Vivekananda. There is absolutely no doubt that this attitude of being proud of the culture and the religion, that I learned from Vivekananda and then from Aurobindo. But then Sri Aurobindo has himself said that he took on whatever he is doing is just a furtherance of the work of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. It is the same impulse, and he is taking it forward. So the first thing that I could say is that to develop that sense of self-confidence. And the other thing that what he used to keep saying, that I have only preached strength, that I have seen only one grand message coming out from the Upanishads, and that is the lesson of strength. And one must develop strength. Strength, of course, he was using the English word for Shakti. I am very famous or notorious or whatever for keeping on telling people Shakti Badao, Shakti Badao. Again, I learned this from him and from Aurobindo. Because become undeniable. This is something that I always tell people, that, don't waste your time trying to be an activist and things like that. Get to a place where you are a somebody, and then you don't need to be an activist. People will listen to you anyway because you're undeniable. And there is a very famous incident, a legendary incident in the life of Vivekananda, where he actually said that I am going away now, and I shall return only when I can burst upon society like a bomb and make it follow me like a dog. He actually said that. Now, if anybody else had said it, we would have said, "Ye to pagal aadmi hai, look at the level of arrogance." But did he not do that? So, he is also articulating the same thing, become undeniable. But for that you need, maybe we should do this on his Mahasamadhi day, but the fact is in one very unusual contribution of Vivekananda to India, which people don't seem to realize, I don't know why, is that he brought back meditation as a central sadhana process. Not since the Buddha did we have somebody who was so specifically stressing on meditation as a central sadhana process. The Buddha was the first, before that it was yajna and all other kinds of processes. The Buddha was the one who made meditation the central. And then not since the Buddha did we have anybody, like it was Vivekananda who once again made meditation a central sadhana process, because he understood that is a quick and easy way to develop strength. And it is unfortunate that even now people don't understand the importance of meditation. So that is another thing we could learn from him. That is another, especially in the sense of, he had two things. One is be strong, Shakti Vada, and the other was be fearless. Again, now his first name was not Narendra. The first given name for him was Vireshwar. He was named after a temple in Kashi, which his mother had prayed for an enlightened spiritual son. And then the Vireshwara Mahadeva came in the dream and said, okay, I shall fulfill that. I shall give you that boon. So Vireshwara, the brave, the heroic god, he had that sense of heroism. He was a literal hero. He was like not in the way we have in our movies, which is all low angle shots and loud music, not like that, but he was a literal hero. That sense of fearlessness and that sense of self-confidence and that the primacy of meditation. There are so many things. I mean, Ramesh has probably made a mistake because I can go on and on and on and on and on, because this is one topic that I never get tired of. But that sense of fearlessness, especially today, it has really disheartened me. Again, this might be a slightly controversial opinion, but it has really disheartened me to see that the common universal psychological quality today is Abhinivesha.
Yeah.
Abhinivesha was famously defined by Swami Vivekananda himself in a brilliant definition. He called it the indecent clinging to life. You don't want to concede that you might die. You don't want to concede that there might be a point when this kind of fear-driven mindset that we are seeing, not just it is bad enough it is in the rest of the world, but in India, where we gave yoga to the world. And to see Abhinivesha be the common psychological quality of people is very distressing. Honestly, it is very distressing. We seem to find it some kind of personal affront to realize that we will die. That is called psychological maturity. Yeah? I mean, what kind of foolishness is going on? So, this thing of the man being absolutely fearless, the man being heroic, the man being so self-confident, and don't think all this came easy, because the kind of tapasya that he did, he himself said the kind of tapasya that he and his Guru Wise did, Asuras would have run away, Rakshasas would have run away. There were weeks, not days, weeks, when they were living on boiled leaves. They were boiling the leaves and drinking the water and chewing the leaves. That was their only food. So this did not come easy. I mean, the kind of tremendous personality that he was, the kind of tremendous power that he was, the Shakti did not come easily. It came with a lot of personal sacrifice, and he was a vibhuti. Vibhutis don't tend to last very long. But even then, I feel that he need not have died so early. But his body had been wrecked, with all the kind of travel and the kind of tapasya, his body had been wrecked. So that's another story for another time. So that was, what shall we say? Third thing I would like to say was that, the name Vivekananda was given to him by Maharaja of Khetri, who had given him the name Vivekananda. It was not his guru's name. It was one of the Maharajas who had given that name, because he realized that how nuanced his thinking was, how brilliant, because Viveka is the ability to discriminate between right and wrong. And again, that is a quality that we direly need today, where all we have is ego investment and excitement. We don't have any operation of Viveka in the public sphere. Now, it might be a pretty harsh thing to say, I don't care. It is the truth. You can see that what we have is just overexcitement. Like, again, there is one book which I recommend to everybody, and that is called Rousing Call to the Hindu Nation. It is a compilation of his interviews and his personal talks. Swami Vivekananda's Rousing Call to the Hindu Nation. In that, he was being interviewed by a Bengali newspaper, and the person asked him, what is your opinion of ahimsa? And that is Vivekananda, like the Viveka, the brilliance of the nuance of the answer is something that has struck me all these years. What he said is, I am for ahimsa. And then he paused and he thought for a while. And he said, for the sannyasi, for the householder, self-defense. So it was not a blanket prescription. It was not like, as it became a perversion and a corruption of a brilliant spiritual concept into a dhimmi training and a cowardice training attitude. He was very clear about it. Only one group of people, under any circumstance, ahimsa is always mandatory. For the rest, it depends on context. And so he had that ability. He had that ability to get to the heart of the matter. He had that ability to discern between what is important and what is urgent, what is relevant and what is contextual. And so again, that is a mental quality that we need to develop. Sri Aurobindo had also commented that the lack of thought power is the greatest problem facing India. Not poverty, not because it is the lack of thought power that we cannot fix our problems. So in that sense, in that sense, so these are qualities which are universal. It would not matter if Vivekananda was, sorry about that. It would not matter if Vivekananda was 500 years back or 50 years back. These are universal qualities. But in a time of transition, as we are transitioning from one kind of society to another kind of society, he was also part of that. He was part of probably the greatest transition in human history. From a purely traditional oil lamp world, a world lit only by fire, from a purely traditional oil lamp world into a modern steam engine. The high-tech technology in those days was telegram, dial.
Telegram is now an app.
Yeah. Yeah. So these are, I think, these are the qualities, and there are so many stories. Like there are. The more you read, so my suggestion is, if you want to understand Vivekananda, you should read this book, for instance, which I mentioned, Rousing Call to the Hindu Nation. Then you should read the life of Swami Vivekananda by his Eastern and Western disciples. Now, there is one brilliant biography by Romain Rolland, where Romain Rolland was a French author. He was a Nobel Prize winner for literature, where he did biographies of Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and then he seemed to think that Gandhi was their spiritual successor. In the third volume, the Ramakrishna Mission bring out volume 1 and 2, they don't bring out volume 3. But Romain Rolland was a genius, but he got the wrong end of the stick because he was looking at it from a French Catholic perspective. And he was constantly trying to make Vivekananda and Ramakrishna into Catholic saints. So the book is brilliant, but it is completely besides the point. It is brilliant because it is written by a man of genius. When he had come to India, he asked Rabindranath Tagore that, who do I read or what do I do to understand India? And he said, read Vivekananda. If you do not understand Vivekananda, you will never understand India. Now there is a Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore is telling, who's a Nobel Prize winner, is telling another Nobel Prize winner that if you do not understand Vivekananda, you will never understand India. But I'm afraid he didn't understand Vivekananda, even though the book is lovely. The book is brilliantly written, but you must read it with the understanding that he's trying to find Catholic saints in these two men. I mean, he could have, the logical thing would have been Sri Aurobindo or Ramana Maharishi. That would have been the third volume. But he wanted to find Christian this thing in the whole. So, unfortunately. Okay, I think I've spoken enough. We can take questions or.
There are a few questions in the chat which are fairly long. I think one question is about Swami Vivekananda's views on the caste system in India. I mean, caste is something that we've had several discussions on it, but essentially the participant wants to know: do you think one of the reasons why Hinduism still struggles to have its space and be more attractive is because of the caste system in India?
Well, this is like too long, but briefly, Vivekananda's thing was that caste will go by itself because of the modern world, because as he himself said, you cannot practice caste on the train. When you're jammed up in the train, you cannot practice caste. And he saw that, I don't know, nowadays it is not there, but in my youth, I'm now old. So, in my youth, you would see Hindu hotel, which meant that the cook was Brahmin, which meant that anybody from any caste could eat over there.
Right.
Yeah. So, if a Brahmin cooks, everybody could eat, but otherwise there would be problems. So people used to have, and when he went to Kerala, he said it is a madhouse because of the caste, this thing. So, this caste issue is being solved. That what he said was that all the subcastes within a varna, all the subcastes should, first, they should stop living in their narrow little lives. They should consolidate amongst themselves. So what he said was that all the jatis within a particular profession or within a particular area, they should start intermingling and intermarrying. And then, so he was of the opinion that it will automatically change. Now, as to the larger question of whether caste is good or bad, first of all, there was no such thing as caste. We had jati and varna. And Jati Varna was a very stable force for a long, long time. Then it became an exploitative force, like everything which outlives its utility. But today, other than voting patterns and marriage, in what way does Jati Varna really play any great important role in?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, at least in urban India, the things have simply flattened out.
Yes, out in the villages, matters are still bad.
Yeah.
Out in the villages, matters are still bad. There's a lot of touchable, chua-chut, all that kind of. But see, there is a problem here in that there is different kinds of morality operating. We have a sort of, it's a complex issue. I don't think 1 hour we can, even if we have 3 hours, we won't. So I am saying that modernity by itself is removing caste bit by bit by bit by bit. The caste feeling, even though it's not all good, there are so many vidyas, there are so many traditions which are embedded within the jati. And as the jati collapses, or the jati feeling collapses, all those knowledge patterns also collapse.
I also had a question on, I've always thought that one of the great contributions of Swami Vivekananda was to democratize the access to Indian scriptures and opening up, of the dharmic repository to the common man.
Yes.
And he did that in a style and panache that was far ahead of his times. I just wanted your thoughts on that. Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right on that. For instance, he wrote commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. It might have been the first serious commentary on Yoga Sutras in about 300-400 years. In fact, the whole popularity of the Patanjali Yoga Sutra again in the 20th century was because of Swami Vivekananda's commentary. He bought that text out of obscurity. So then the Ramakrishna Mission and the Advaita Ashram publications, they have brought out nearly every available extant spiritual text. They have bought it out in good, high quality translation, subsidized prices. So when I hear so-called trads or whatever abuse him, I'm like, the man bought out Vedanta, he bought out the Upanishads, he bought out Yoga Sutra. How much more traditional do you want him to be? So this ties into another question that I think Rashi had asked, that there is criticism of him. And there is not criticism of him, it is caste prejudice at play, because according to them, there are certain shastras which say only Brahman can become a sannyasi. Okay, correct. There are some shastras which say that. There are other shastras which also say there are various grades of sannyasa, which all other varnas can have. So which shastra are you going to follow? Now, for them, the shastra which says, no, he was not a Brahman, therefore he cannot be a sannyasi. And I mean, when you have an obvious spiritual colossus like Vivekananda, and then you're going to say that it doesn't count because of his caste, this is some sort of insanity. This is some sort of crackpottery that I cannot understand. How stupid do you have to be to just say that? How can you, reading him today, I mean, when people used to go into hysterics literally when they would attend his talks, because the Shakti that was coming off him was so immense. Even today we can feel it. Just reading it, we can feel the Shakti, how it must have been when he was personally there. And to say that he doesn't count or he's not valid because he's not traditional, which is not true, because he was one of the greatest defenders of tradition. He would always say that the man of tradition, you can do something with the man of tradition. So, this, I suppose it is like, you try to make a name for yourself by attacking the most revered or the most. Now, I do not say that Vivekananda was all perfect and, like without any fault or flaw. This is another thing. When we admire somebody, we start projecting perfection onto them, which is like not a good thing. And he himself would not have admired that. He himself would not have liked that. But in general, and the criticism of him is not even a sensible criticism. In Madras, when he came back, when, there were lectures from Colombo to Almora, he was lecturing. He landed in Colombo and then he went all the way across India lecturing. And in Chennai, in one meeting, this whole issue was raised. This issue of the caste was raised, and that, you cannot be a sannyasi and you have gone abroad. So, like, we shouldn't listen to you. You're not worthy of being listened to. And one of his brother disciples, I think it was Avedananda, whose nickname was Kali. So you can understand. And Avedananda pointed out that in one Shastra, it is mentioned that if you are under Mlecha rule for over 25 years, then you become Shudra. Everybody becomes Shudra. So he said, yeah. So he said, okay, now, since you're such great Shastra lovers, how about this Shastra? So after that question was not asked. Now, I've been trying to find that. Some people say it is in Manusmriti. I have not been able to find it. Now, it could be that it is not in Manusmriti, it is in some other Smriti. It could also be that people are bringing out editions and removing, like Gita Press has the habit of doing that. They remove
things that
they remove verses. Yeah, they remove verses. Gita Press, all of them have the habit. They remove inconvenient verses. But it was there, and he quoted that scripture, and it was a little scandal at the time. It was a little scandal at the time where he, so, what I say is, so welcome my fellow Shudras, And another time, since we are talking about caste and about, what is the value of scripture, in Tamil Nadu, he found that, not in Tamil Nadu, when he was in Trivandrum, he found the Nair community. So he said that according to Manusmriti, if you cohabit with Brahmins for 7 generations, you are also Brahmins. So he actually made the proposal that Nairs should declare themselves to be Brahmins. And of course, the Diwan, who was a Tambram, he started sweating at the notion of such a radical, So, since I am a Nair, and, so I can therefore say that on the authority of Manusmriti, on the authority of Swami Vivekananda, and my own authority, I am therefore saying, okay, Nairs are Brahmins. let us create, let us create some turmoil and some controversy. Let us just set some people's teeth on edge. You cannot pick and choose. See, there was that post you had made 2 days back, Ramesh, where you said that Smritis have to be reinterpreted in context again and again and again.
Right. Absolutely critical.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. I think a couple of questions, I try to club them into one. I think one question is asking is that if Swami Vivekananda would be alive today, how would he have addressed the issue of Hindus moving away from becoming generally forgetting their cultural moorings, one, and two is how he seemed to be particularly focused more on Advaita, Vedanta, and all of those things. I'm just clubbing what looks like two very.
Okay, I think I'll answer the second question first. He was trying to find something that would be non-sectarian. So Advaita Vedanta was for him something that would be non-sectarian, that everybody could follow. But that is not to say that he did not like puja, devta. He even in the Belur Mutt, they even have a shrine to the Om. They even have a shrine with Om over there, because what he said was that if you cannot accept the Om, then you are not a Hindu, go out. He said, at least the Om is common to everybody. If you are a Hindu, at least Om is common to everybody. If you cannot accept the Om, then go out. He actually said that. He has said a lot of things which, the current secular consensus does not like. This is one of them, that if you do not, and then the other one was that we must resist conversion, because everybody who leaves the Hindu fold is not only one Hindu the less, but one enemy the more, which is something that, Shashi Tharoor didn't like it when Jai Sai Deepak pointed out all the things. So he has said many. So the first part, what is the first question? The first question was.
Yeah, I think the same question also said that it's not relevant to the topic as such. So that's the reason I dropped that, in the sense that, do you think Tantra also will help build Shakti, it says, but
yes, of course. But no, the first part of the question was something else. What was you had asked 2 questions. One question was about the Vedanta, and I was like, he was trying to find something that transcended sectarianism.
Transcended sectarianism, yeah. And I think if Swami Vivekananda would have been alive today, and if he would have seen how many of us seem to be disowning our own cultural roots and our moorings,
it was not any different in his time.
Right.
It was absolutely the same thing in his time. Hinduism was a characterological evil even then for them. It was under attack. The young people were just as woke then. There is a famous incident of a fellow who was dragged, a young guy, new intellectual, Navaparivartan, whatever nonsense. He was dragged to Kalighat, and his father told him, do namaste. So he said, hello, madam. To the Devi. He said, hello, madam. So, so what is different? He would have been exactly the same as he was. And, Swami Chinmayananda once said something which I just loved, and that is also a very big part of my life. And he said that my job is to convert Hindus to Hinduism.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what I'm doing also.
Yeah.
That's what he was doing. That's what I'm doing. I mean, again, it comes down to we need to be the example. I'm not bragging here, but I have at least 1,000 people have told me over the last 5-6 years, separately and incidentally. I was a complete secularist. I completely hated Hinduism, Indian culture. And because of you, Sri Guru, I came back and I realized how wonderful and what legacy and what inheritance and what value we have. So, each person becomes the example. I'm seeing Ramchandra is in the chat. I'm seeing you are there. I'm seeing so many people. All of these people have little voice. All of these people have little. We have to become. See, there is a coolness factor to these things. Things have to be fashionable. And Hinduism at the moment is not very fashionable.
Right.
There has to be an attractiveness factor. And so they got to see examples of people who tend to be out of the norm, who tend to be pretty spectacular people, and they are very dharmic, then they will also become dharmic. So the struggle is exactly the same. Vivekananda would have been the same today, just as he was in his time, because the times are not different. It is frightening how similar the times are. It is absolutely frightening that the children coming out of college are exactly the same idiots who used to come out of college like at that time. With the same mindset, the same attitude, the same stupid arguments, the same ignorance, the same complete lack. See, deracination has been a singular problem ever since the Raj came on. Ever since the British Raj and the Company Bahadur came, deracination has been the single biggest problem. And even look at the irony of what we are doing. We are talking in English about deracination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only language where we can reach everybody who's on the.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there is but he would not have been any different, I can tell you. In fact, he probably he would have upped his gear a bit. He would have upped his gear a bit. He would have insisted. So I am saying we need to be the example. You're doing the Vishnu Sahasranama, and maybe it is not getting that much traction, whatever. But I know a lot of people are looking at it very seriously and they're understanding so many things. Which Swami had said that even if all the temples go and all the books go just from the Sahasranama, we can reconstruct the entire puja and the worship of the Devta. So there are certain, when you see people engaging with the culture, when you see people you respect valuing the culture, you will also start valuing. People need examples. So I'm not like I have that much great influence, but individually, at least 1,000 people I can say I brought back. At least 1,000 people I brought back. It's not a big deal. What is 1,000 amongst 1 billion? But there is 1,000 less enemies. And 1,000 less stupid people also, one can say, which is also very important. The level of stupidity in the country is suffocating.
There is also a question on Sri Guru Pranam. Could you please throw some light on the 100 enlightened people SP wanted for the revolution to change the country, which is unfortunately unfulfilled?
That is something. He wanted 100 dedicated, selfless people. Even Sadhguru Jaggi Vasudeva has recently said that we couldn't provide 100 people. He also cannot find those 100 people. It's been a problem. It's been a problem. But yeah, if we have 100, if we have 100 phenomenal people working single-handedly, lots of things will change. Though he was talking when we had a population of 330 million. Now we have 1 billion more than that. So, I doubt if 100 will do. So see, 100 is just it's like a symbolic number that we need a core group of people who are enlightened, who are dharmic, who are tireless, and then it will overflow into the in the Yoga Sutras. Where is it mentioned that how the enlightenment happens is that the Shakti builds up like water builds up behind the dam, and then when the monsoon comes, it overflows and then it floods the whole land. So we need that core to set off the snowball, and then it will become an avalanche. So it's not like 100 is not a specific number that 100 chahiye, 101 या 99 will be not. It's not like that. It means we need a core of dedicated people.
Core of dedication.
We need a core of dedicated people, and not only dedicated people. There are many people with dedication, but people with Shakti.
I'll make a little segue here because we are
Yes.
close to this one. I wanted your Vivekananda's views on education. They're also very radical and far ahead of the curve, particularly his views on women education and
Well,
what
tell you.
yeah and what were the influences that particularly informed his views, and how did all of these things shape up, and what came out of his views on education?
See, you must realize that Vivekananda was a Brahmo first.
Yeah.
Then he became Ramakrishna's disciple. So he had all those Brahmo ideas of literacy, English education, women's rights, women's empowerment, all those kind of things he had, which are all good things. Even though almost every organization called Samaj has ended up in a big fat failure, that is another matter. But they had fundamentally reasonably good ideas, at least in the social sphere. In the theological sphere, all these Samaj organizations are dreadful. And okay, this might upset people, I don't care. From a theological point of view, they are disguised Abrahamism. Let us be blunt.
Right.
Let us be absolutely blunt about it. But from a sociological sphere, now he did not want he knew that this Babu producing education is useless and pathetic. He was very clear about it. That the Babu producing, and so again, in that same letter where he praised Japan, go and learn from Japan, he also said something very interesting about the Indian graduate. Is there not water enough in the ocean to drown you? Books, gowns, diplomas, degrees, and all.
Right.
So he wanted what he called man-making education. And he was very, surprisingly, considering that he was a sannyasi, he was a Brahmo, he was a Bhadralok, he was a Bengali, all those things. He was very open to the entrepreneurial mindset. He always wanted people to do business. He did not want people to do service, which is like so different from the normal perception of that category of people. He was like, no, there is a psychological problem with being a servant. Chakri. The Bengali word for that is chakri. And there is a certain, how shall we say, lack of status and lack of dignity in that word only. Chakri. So he was very clear that an education which does not enable you to live independently and provide for yourself is not an education at all. Because the education that the British were creating was an education in servility. It was very clear that it is an education in servility. They wanted lower level posts, gomastas. They wanted clerks. So first of all, he wanted universal education. Again, the British did something that even the Mughals didn't manage to do. They completely destroyed the indigenous educational system. Dharmapal is the beautiful tree, and all works of Sahana Singh. You can read. We had a 97% literacy in this country before the British, and they wiped us out. They wiped out all the traditional educational institutions. They wiped out. So he wanted universal education, of course, which, by the way, is one of our greatest failures post-independence. We have exceedingly exotic courses in IITs, plasma physics, but we don't have primary education के लिए पैसा नहीं है. You know, it has been a number one problem with India is that we have not invested in our primary education. We have not created a good primary education system, government or private. So we have very poor human capital, human resources capital, because we have very poorly educated people. We have people who cannot think. We have people who have never been taught to think. We have people who have no real genuine access to knowledge, all of which were matters that deeply concerned him. Now, we cannot any longer blame the British. They went a long time back. So whatever is currently there is our choice and our responsibility. We have failed our people, and especially the poorest people, because we have not created a system or a methodology where the poorest people can educate themselves out of their poverty. So that is a tragedy. Now, as to his notion, very clearly, man-making education, that is to be self-reliant, that is to be entrepreneurial. I mean, there are certain conversations where he's trying to urge his young friends, start up an export business, take Bengali fabrics, go to England, sell it over there, do. He's giving him the entire plan, and that fellow is panicking. I can't do it. I can't. You know, so this entrepreneurial stress that he had, that, you know, you need to not do chakri. You need to have your own business. You know, that was something, I think, astonishing for the time, because other than the traditional Vaishya community, other than the traditional business communities, nobody had that mindset at the time. And he had it. I think because he went abroad, he went to America, and he saw how self-reliant the people were. He went to Japan and he saw and you know, we had a lot of traditional arts and crafts, which were industries which also got decimated. And then people were forced onto the land to do farming. So there were a lot of complexities. There's a lot of complexities in that. But until we fix primary education, I'm afraid all other plans are just pie in the sky. You know, now we have more or less got electricity to all parts of the country, very good. But even if it is not 24 hours, at least electricity is there. Now toilets are also more or less there, very good. But the next real major social challenge, as I see it, is that we need to fix our educational system, and our educational system has become almost irredeemably corrupt. I don't know if there is any way around it. Now, unless there is some kind of social revolution, I do not know if there is any way around it. But unless you fix your primary education, you can forget it. You know, like from my childhood, I've been seeing every 5 years, some magazine used to have the cover, is India the next superpower? India the next superpower. Don't be in delusion, people. The levels of malnourishment that you have in our country, the levels of pathetic education that you have in our country, nobody is going to be a superpower with malnourished, mal-educated people. We are lucky. We got a good break in life. Our parents sent us to good schools, whatever. We are lucky. We are very fortunate. I always say what I have got was just pure dumb luck. But the average person in the village does not have that luck. Or the average person in the city slum does not have that luck. And so, you know, unless we grasp this netter, unless we deal with this colossal failure of primary education, our social problems will not be solved.
Absolutely.
This might be a little depressing thing to hear, but it is the truth.
No,
And
no,
we
no,
have,
not at all. I think only last week we actually saw it play out right in our eyes when we were in Hubli and visiting a couple of villages where we
yeah,
realized that unless you address this critical issue, there's no way that we're going to.
yeah.
I just have time for one more, and one of the
Please.
things that he said, which is quite controversial and not quite mentioned, is that he said, uh, I do not want to preserve a religion which is easily disproved by the discoveries of in science and
Hmm,
which maintains its hold on its flock only through dogma, superstition, or fear.
hmm,
So there must be internal consistency and external empirical proof. And he
hmm.
said, yeah, so that is the kind of religion that he wanted. You don't so just wanted your thoughts on that because that is absolutely how I would also like to see it. And I think the so just
But isn't that the Hindu way anyways?
right,
You pick
right,
up a sadhana, you pick up a method, you see if it works for you.
correct, absolutely.
You know, and if it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. And we don't have, fortunately, though now people are trying to bring that stupid attitude in, we don't have one supreme authority
Right.
who can never be questioned under any circumstance. We always have our entire Hindu society and Hindu dharma has been negotiating competing claims. Like, look at Tamil Nadu. Best Shiva temples, best Vishnu temples. Like simultaneously.
Right. Yes.
And both of them have Puranas where, he is supreme.
Hmm.
But it is both, they are both organic part of the culture. They are intertwined. There is no, this is better, this is worse. So some people may say so, but it is. So we have always negotiated, our faith has always been negotiated in a term of competing claims, of competing. So in that sense, I don't see that if something is manifestly proven to be untrue, why would you hang on to it? Like I think he has very clearly also somewhere else, Swamiji has very clearly said that if something has been, if your faith collapses at the first touch of truth, then it is a false faith. You give it up. I think we are almost out of time. Anything else?
I think we are almost at the end of it. I think we could go on for another 2 hours if.
No, we can easily go on. That's what I said. Ramesh didn't know what he was getting on.
Yeah, so
I'm just getting warmed up,
right, but yeah. So what I will do now is I'm absolutely thankful, and I know that you have not been doing videos for a very long time. You've not been coming on talks. So I'm absolutely grateful that you accepted and came on this. It's been an absolute pleasure.
He said, my guru told me not to, so that is why.
Right. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to have had you on this.
I'm so grateful that you called me on and I could pontificate on my favorite topic.
And I will now ask Sudarshan to propose the vote of thanks from the Vivekananda Institute of Indian Studies side.
Thank you, Ramesh. Guruji, it has been such a wonderful experience listening to you. And a few take-home messages for all of us. We started off with your view that anything that endures becomes more valuable.
Yes.
In fact, the start itself is more valuable for all of us in Vivekananda Institute of Indian Studies. And yes, tradition itself being a problem, quite a paradox. And of course, the traditionalist and reformist views of Swami Vivekananda once again opening a lot for discussion. Yoga and meditation as central sadhana processes that Swami Vivekananda propounded, and reading Swami Vivekananda even today, we can feel his enormous presence, his Shakti, and his pervading inspiration. That was really a very, very important message for all of us. Let us celebrate role models That is the way evolution can happen. One more important message from the discourse that we had today, and a lot of radical views and messages for introspection and thought process were there. And finally, I want to quote poet John Donne when he says, "A thought in itself is an experience. It modifies our sensibilities." When we think of Swami Vivekananda, it itself is an experience. It modifies our sensibilities. And yes, the very thought of bringing this lecture series every month, the same day on the 12th of every month for the next 1 year, it's a wonderful thought. It will be an experience for all of us. And from all of us here, from Vivekananda Institute of Indian Studies and We Lead, which are units of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, I take this opportunity to gratefully thank you for your presence, for your sharing your expertise, and also for your thoughts on Swami Vivekananda today, beginning the inaugural lecture. Thank you so much, Swamiji. And I also take this opportunity to thank all the participants who have not only interacted with you, given your questions, through your questions and your thoughts, and paved way for a more number of such interesting conversations and interactions to follow. So I look forward to having you every month, the same day, 12th of every month, the same time probably, taking themes drawn from the inspiration of Swami Vivekananda. And from all of us here, I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you and namaste to one and all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sarvam Shivamaya.